However, what we see the PRC and the PLAN doing is doing more and more complex operations at greater distances from the PRC coast. And the further you operate from the PRC coast, the more difficult those operations are, and the more complex those operations can be. The more coordination is required at tactical and operational levels. And doing these complex operations, they are improving tremendously. How do you measure how good a Navy is? You look at what they're actually doing and how capable they are. There is going to be a collision. There's going to be a loss of life at some point in the future. And that's unfortunate if things continue on this pace. Certainly at the top, I think there is a discussion that's going on. Xi Jinping is in charge. Xi Jinping is likely calling many of the shots, but there is a lot of input that is going in that is being discussed at the senior-most levels of the Chinese government. Ultimately, it is Xi Jinping's call, however.
Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive into the ever-evolving landscape of international affairs. In today's video, we're delving into the People's Liberation Army's defense budget and the recent appointment of the new Minister of Defense. We'll be dissecting the recent purges within the PLA and shedding light on the PLA Navy submarine training. We then explore the escalating conflict with the Philippines and the unexpected support coming from both Japan and the Philippines for Taiwan. We uncover the fascinating dynamic of China's neighbors forming strategic alliances, creating a network of cooperation. At the end, some predictions about what to expect in 2024. The world is watching, and so are we.
Hi everyone. Today we have a guest. It's Christopher Sharman. He's an Indo-Pacific security strategist, research director, associate professor, and a veteran. Christopher, welcome to the show.
Richard, thanks so much for having me on.
Great. Could you please tell us a little bit about your military background? That's really highly interesting.
Oh, thanks. Thanks for asking. I spent 30 years as a naval intelligence officer. My assignments included ships. Of course, I was on several aircraft carriers. I was on command ship in 7th Fleet. I've kind of had a unique background in that I've also had the opportunity to serve in embassies. So I served as a naval attaché in China, and I also served as the naval attaché in Vietnam. And my career culminated just a few months ago when I retired from the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, where I was a senior strategist for what's called the National Intelligence Manager for East Asia. So that's a position that orchestrates the intelligence efforts for all of East Asia.
I wanted to ask you at the beginning, the first thing about the China's published defense budget, which it's a topic for discussion because it's probably the money they spend on military is probably much higher than we know or than we assume. Could you please elaborate a little bit on that?
Sure, I'll say a few words on that. China certainly does publish a defense budget, like many countries, which is wonderful that they're doing that. However, China's defense budget doesn't account for a few things, one of which is some of their research and development doesn't actually fall into their defense budget. And so when we publish in the United States, we publish our defense budget, the R&D that goes into defense procurement, et cetera, is all folded into our defense budget. That's kept separate. And so as a result, their defense budget is probably much higher. Another part that is, I think, somewhat misleading with the numbers that they have is that a lot of their corporations that are doing their defense production are state-owned enterprises. And those state-owned enterprises are, of course, subsidized by the government, so they don't have to compete against other companies. And so it's somewhat an artificial ability to produce arms at perhaps at a cost that's somewhat artificially low.
The PLA has a new leader, Admiral Dong Jun, who was appointed China's 14th Minister of National Defense. Maybe you could talk a little bit about him and the recent purges. How does it all fit together?
Well, yeah, China does. Their new Minister of Defense is an admiral, first of all, and that's noteworthy. This is the first time that China's defense minister has been a Navy admiral, come from the service, from the Navy. It says a lot about in my opinion, it says a lot about where China wants to take the PLA. I think it's important first to talk about what Dong Jun's position is. As defense minister, he's not orchestrating the activities, the operations of the PLA. What he's responsible for doing is much of the international engagement on behalf of the People's Liberation Army. So he's the face of the PLA. He's the one that we're going to see on TV. He's going to be the one who's going to be going to various conferences and being the interlocutor, of course, with our defense minister and with all defense ministers around the world. Now, what makes him particularly interesting and an interesting pick is that he has a quite an operational background, but he came up where he was prior to the position he's in right now as defense minister. He was a leader of the Navy. And that's where he honed some of his engagement skills. He was one of the pioneering officers to work with the Russians in some of the Russian cooperation that China and Russia do. He also was in the Eastern Theater Command, where he managed joint operations. And this, I think, is one of the key takeaways for about Dong Jun. He has tremendous joint experience. Joint experience is still somewhat new for the People's Liberation Army. And to have an officer that has the background that he has really says about a lot about the direction that that China wants to take the PLA. And it allows, because he has both an operational background and a joint experience background, it'll allow him to engage with his peers and his counterparts around the world and to truly speak from a position of authority as someone who has managed, commanded, and operated in the joint environment. So he's a particularly unique choice, and I think it does say a lot about where the PLA is going. The second part of your question, of course, is about the purges. I think anyone who told you that they knew exactly why Xi Jinping had done those purges, you could probably see through that a little bit. I don't think anyone knows exactly why the purges have happened. There are some reports in the media that are talking, and we all know that the PLA traditionally is a very corrupt organization. Corruption is endemic in the system, but it's corruption is within the system, and it's not only the PLA, it's the PRC government as a whole. There's a tremendous amount of corruption that exists. Xi Jinping has made an effort to try and clap down on some of the corruption that is ongoing, not only in the PLA, but within the PRC as a whole. One of the toughest nuts to crack, though, for him is the corruption that continues to exist within the PLA. Now, there's certainly far less of it, or there likely is far less of it than there was in prior years, or at least it's not as obvious as perhaps, and is not as much in your face as it was in the past. But for the PLA, corruption still exists. And it is very likely that some of these senior leaders, the prior defense minister, Li Shangfu, as well as some of the other leaders from the long-range artillery or the strategic rocket forces, were taken out because they were part of a Guanxi network. They were all connected to each other, and some of their connections were likely corrupt. And what I think may have happened is that there were some operational requirements that were levied on the strategic rocket forces in particular, and the strategic rocket forces were not able to meet whatever those requirements were. And it was when they looked back exactly why, I suspect corruption was at its core. So I think that's how it all ties together. But I think, again, Dong Jun as a leader will be a very interesting defense minister for the face of the PLA for the foreseeable future.
Liking and subscribing is greatly appreciated, and it helps me keep this channel going. My goal is to spread the opinions and experience of the best people in this industry.
There's always the question, how much are the people, especially since Xi Jinping is on his third term, how much are those appointments about merit and how much are those guys just yes men? So I that could be actually to our advantage because maybe they're weaker substantially or professionally than we think, than we assume. But what do you think? How good are those guys, especially if you compare them to the maybe U.S. Navy or U.S. Air Force?
I think what I do is I take a look at what are the career jobs that these people have had that have allowed them to rise in the ranks, that have put them in the places that they have. Certainly, in the case of Dong Jun, who is from the Shandong Peninsula, I think born in Yantai, if I'm not mistaken, somewhere on the Shandong Peninsula. He has served a very, very effective career within the military and has proven himself along the way. Now, in the PLA, you don't get ahead by speaking back against authority. You generally have to go along to get along to continue to promote. And there are ways of doing things. If you don't like something, you have to do it very subtly, and you have to organize people to push back in very gentle ways. So, I think that's very much true of the PRC organization as a whole. That you don't get a lot of truth telling at certain levels. Certainly at the top, I think there is a discussion that's going on. Xi Jinping is in charge. Xi Jinping is likely calling many of the shots, but there is a lot of input that is going in that is being discussed at the senior-most levels of the Chinese government. Ultimately, it is Xi Jinping's call, however.
You've recently published also at the US Naval War College this report, PLAN Submarine Training in the New Era. So how effective do you think is the whole organization? Like how good is China's Navy? We had like few months back, we had this accident in the strait where this one submarine disappeared, vanished. Like what do you think about that?
Well, first of all, regarding that accident, I don't know if we've ever seen that confirmed. So we'll take that as internet rumors
Yes,
for now.
yes.
But
Hmm.
fair enough. I think your question is absolutely fair. So let's take a step back for a second, Richard. Let's take a look at what the PLA Navy is as a whole. 370 ships. That's how many ships that are part of the Chinese Navy. 140 of those 370 are major surface combatants that they have. This is a lot of ships. This gives China the largest navy in the world in terms of the numbers, numerically, the largest navy in the world. That's in itself an impressive feat. Now, how good are they? I think what we have seen is the ability to get better and better over time. Are they 10 feet tall? No. Are they 2 feet tall? No. They're probably somewhere in the middle. However, what we see the PRC and the PLAN doing is doing more and more complex operations at greater distances from the PRC coast. And the further you operate from the PRC coast, the more difficult those operations are and the more complex those operations can be, the more coordination is required at tactical and operational levels. And so as they are operating further and further, moving from just operating in what they would call the near seas into the far seas, and that's outside the first island chain, and doing these complex operations, they are improving tremendously. We see Chinese Navy ships operating up around Alaska. We see them operating in the South Pacific. They've been operating for over a decade over in the Gulf of Aden, conducting counter-piracy patrols. These are not easy operations. And so how do you measure how good a Navy is? You look at what they're actually doing and how capable they are. They've come a long way. Let me tell you one story that I think will help put this in context. When I came into the Navy early on, I used to watch Chinese frigates, and this is when I was a young junior officer. I would watch Chinese frigates go out to sea for just a matter of a couple days. And they would go out to sea for a couple days because they would want to stay within sight of coast. They couldn't produce enough water on board, and then they'd go back in. And that's how they operated, a little over 30 years ago. Now we see them operating around the world, doing circumnavigations, operating routinely in the Gulf of Aden, operating the second past the first island chain up around Alaska with the Russians and doing coordinated operations. That's tremendous growth in 30 years. So when you ask the question, how good is the Chinese Navy? I think it's a really hard one to answer. I think you look at its equipment, you look at its, but you also have to look at the capabilities, and those capabilities are on the ascendancy.
Yeah, because a lot of people, they constantly claim the PLAN doesn't have real combat experience, but they keep practicing and exercising like there is no tomorrow. They are all over the place. So that's exactly what I think. That actually people should treat them a bit more seriously. And I mean that's what you're saying, right?
I think it's absolutely important to take them very seriously, and they are focused on defeating and rivaling the United States. They have a goal in mind of being. They look at the United States as kind of the gold standard of the Navy, and they are working very, very hard to develop the capabilities, the tactics to be able to take the United States on. Are they there yet? Probably not yet. But are they moving in that direction? They certainly are. But Richard, you raise a really interesting question. What happens in combat? What happens when they're really tested? We don't know. We haven't seen it. But we have seen them improve a tremendous amount, and presumably they're working on how do they function in times when there is disorder, when there's chaos. How do they operate at a time when they don't have direct orders? So that kind of operation has to be going in their training right now. We just may not be seeing it.
I would like to move to a second part and discuss actually a real conflict that is now going on in the South China Sea, and I mean the Philippines. So where do you see the situation they're going? And as a little background, on December 16th, we had an article in the China Daily that actually voiced plans to take a stronger stand against the Philippines and the Second Thomas Shoal, and kind of almost threatening the Philippines and the US. So where do you see the situation going there?
That's a great question. That is a really difficult situation at Second Thomas Shoal. But to just paint the picture, I know your listeners are very familiar with what the ongoing situation down at Second Thomas Shoal, where since 1999 the Sierra Madre, the Philippines LST Sierra Madre, has been grounded deliberately on Second Thomas Shoal, and since that time there's been a platoon of Marines that have been stationed on board. These are Filipino Marines. These Filipino Marines, of course, have to be resupplied. They need provisions. But in 1999, we're in the year 2024 now. That's 25 years of this rusting hulk that's sitting on the coast, sitting on the shore of Second Thomas Shoal, that is literally falling apart and could fall apart at any minute. And these Marines are trying to live in this rusting hulk. It's a very austere and very difficult conditions. They need to be resupplied. So now we have the Filipinos that are attempting to resupply. And these interactions between the PRC and the Filipinos, these aren't new. These kinds of activities, these kinds of things that the PRC is doing, where they're using water cannons, they're using really aggressive maneuvering around Filipino boats, shouldering, actual colliding with Filipino boats. Those kinds of things have happened in the past. What's different now is the Filipinos have taken a very unique approach, and they are using some good colleagues of mine, some good friends of mine will call it assertive transparency. And they are documenting every single thing that the PRC is doing for the whole world to see PRC bad behavior. And so we have now what I would say is a bit of a collision course going on. We have PRC with its claims over the 9 or 10- line, of which Second Thomas Shoal falls into it. And you have Second Thomas Shoal is also only 106 nautical miles away from the landmass of the Philippines. So it's well within the exclusive economic zone of the Philippines. So by international law, the Second Thomas Shoal would, of course, belong to the Philippines. Yet you have this overlapping claims. But PRC, for its part, can't show that it's going to back down. It can't cede this territory in any way. Similarly, the Philippines has learned from its experience at Scarborough Shoal back in 2012 that if it walks back, if it takes a more docile approach to the way that the PRC is acting, that the PRC is going to fill that void, and the PRC will assert control and will have control of Second Thomas Shoal if the Philippines ever walks away from it in any way. So what I see we have here is a true collision course. This isn't going to be solved on the seas. It's not going to be solved by the ships maneuvering around each other. There is going to be a collision. There's going to be a loss of life at some point in the future, and that's unfortunate if things continue on this pace. What has to happen here are the diplomats must be talking and finding a way to maneuver around this. And I think those kind of conversations have happened in the past. I don't think they've borne much fruit, but that if they try and solve it, it's not going to be solved at sea. At sea, there's two forces that are about to hit each other. And I think we're in for a bit of a dangerous time. And let me cap on top of this right now. I think the situation at Second Thomas Shoal has gotten particularly acute. Just today, the president of the Philippines congratulated President-elect Tsai Ing-wen of Taiwan for his election victory that happened over the weekend. A standard practice, and that's a very nice gesture. But in this case, it was the president of the Philippines that was wishing congratulations to a president-elect. Of course, in Beijing's mind, this is a major blow. You have a president congratulating a president, of which the PRC does not recognize as a president. So the PRC has had a very, very strong reaction to the Philippines, using words like, the Philippines, you're playing with fire by your congratulations to the Taiwans and to the Taiwan president-elect. And what I'm afraid is going to happen here is that we may actually see the PRC express some of its displeasure through some of its maritime activities down around Second Thomas Shoal. It's one of the few places where these forces are coming into direct contact, and I think we could see some tensions escalate even further than they already are. I'm not an optimist.
Yeah, but that's actually both of China's adversaries who were bullied, the Japanese Minister of Foreign Affairs and the President of the Philippines. So actually both fought back using let's call it the Taiwan card. So they both have actually the same way to cope, to deal with China. So they would have to deal with both of them, Japan and the Philippines.
Well, and I think that's one of the best things that countries like the Philippines can be doing right now. Frankly, it's one of the best things that Taiwan can be doing right now, is to wrap your arms around the world, to partner with nations from around the world, and don't make this a bilateral issue between your country and China. The issues that these countries are dealing with are international issues. These are global norms, standards, rules, laws that all countries benefit from. The more that the Philippines, Taiwan can coordinate with the international community to partner in ways, maybe even through maritime patrols, do things that they need to show restraint. It's important that the Philippines shows restraint, but they need to continue to work with countries from around the world to show this isn't just a bilateral issue. They are being challenged on their international norms that the world would recognize as Filipino claims.
Yeah, that's what it more and more looks like, that the spokes are cooperating. They're not waiting for the hub, but they are just like Japan, the Philippines, India, and yeah, maybe one day they would even cooperate more officially with Taiwan. I mean, I think this is the way they are going. So 2024 might see some new developments with it in this regard, that China's neighbors might start really make it more a multilateral issue, right?
Well, and I think we're seeing that. I think we're seeing greater cooperation, especially when you look at Japan or Korea operating with Southeast Asian nations even more closely. There is tremendous cooperation and coordination. I was in Vietnam as the naval attaché in Vietnam. I saw very close coordination between Vietnam, which has disputes with China, of course, in the maritime domain, and Japan, and you saw cooperation. You see the more that China pushes, on different places, the more cooperation there is amongst those that are around it. On the other hand, all these countries have to live next to China. China's not going away. The PRC is not going away anytime soon. So they have to find a way to push back, but push back in a way that protects their sovereignty, their territorial integrity, and preserves and prevents any sort of conflict from breaking out. The last thing they need is a neighbor who is very, very angry with them.
If you believe in me, please like it, leave a comment and share the show with friends. It might not look like it, but I have quite a lot of expenses. I am not asking for money, only for support. The goal of this program is to spread the knowledge.
My last question: we're having this discussion in January 2024. What would we be researching, or maybe following? What should we all be looking at in 2024? What do you think are the problems or maybe events coming at us?
Yeah, it's a great question, Richard. There is just a fundamental understanding of the PLA that I think we all need to have. We need a better understanding of Chinese strategy, both around its coast and where it wants to go around the world, and kind of what its objectives are. I think it's very important that we understand that China's not out to conquer the world. It's not out to take territory physically, but it is out to change the norms and standards that the world operates. And I think a better understanding of Chinese tactics, of how they employ those tactics around the world, and not just the military sphere, but the economic sphere, the diplomatic sphere, the informational sphere. That informational, how they use information as a weapon, I think is ripe for additional research. So there's a whole host of different things that we need to be looking at. I run the China Maritime Studies Institute, CMSI, in Newport. I have a team of researchers that is very actively looking at different aspects of China right now. We're taking a look at PLA logistics capability. Specifically, we're looking in at that nexus of that civil military fusion. How does the military leverage the civil society to advance what it wants to do? I think that civil military nexus is another area that's incredibly ripe for research.
Great. Chris, thank you very much for your time and your insights. I appreciate it a lot. Thank you.
Oh, Richard, thank you so much for having me on.